I want to thank everyone out there for joining us today. It's the end of what I'm sure for many of you has been a long and trying day. This is sort of new territory, at least in recent years, for the May revision. It's typically been a relatively uneventful day. This May revision is different. There are significant changes from the governor's January proposal. Some of those reflect a prioritization of public schools, for which we're grateful. But unfortunately, there are some negative aspects of the May revision, which are ominous for public school budgets. We're here today to help you understand both the pros and the cons of the May revision and what the implications are for California public schools and the students that you serve. Next slide, please. Before we get into the heart of the presentation and discuss the budget details, we want to make sure that everyone can participate in today's event. If you'd like to submit questions, I'll refer you to the dashboard. You'll see on the dashboard that there are a number of gray menu bars, one of which is labeled questions. Right before the word question, there's a triangle which faces to the right. Click on that triangle so it's pointing downward. That will expand a text box into which you can enter your question and hit send the same way you would with a text message on your phone or an email on your computer. That question will then be received by staff behind the scenes. We've had unprecedented interest in this webinar, so we won't be able to answer every individual question, but we will try to answer as many different subject areas and topics as we can. And those which we can get to in today's presentation, we will answer via our COVID-19 website, where we have an FAQ section. To reach that website, which has an abundance of resources related to COVID-19 response from a school district perspective, please visit csba.org/coronavirus. That's csba.org/coronavirus, and you will see the answers to many of your questions there. But we know you're eager to get things started, so to kick off the presentation, I will turn it over to CSBA CEO and Executive Director, Vernon M. Billy.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today to learn more about the governor's May revise. This May revision is the most important May revise to be introduced in the last decade without question. In short, the governor's budget attempts to mitigate the effects of the rapid decline of the state's economy on schools. But unfortunately, he's also calling for cuts to schools. The proposed revise does not go far enough to support school districts and county offices of education for the actual costs associated with simultaneously educating students and responding to the COVID-19 crisis. We believe having sufficient resources will be critically important if we're going to be able to continue to educate students in this current virtual environment. Unfortunately, the governor's budget doesn't allow for that, and nor is it sufficient to educate students when they are physically back in schools with the additional requirements that may be associated with teaching students in this physical environment under these conditions. And I think, as all of you know, even before the COVID-19 crisis, nearly 70% of California's LEAs were deficit spending, and 40% were contemplating layoffs as they coped with rising costs. The added expense and challenges presented by the COVID-19 response have only exacerbated what we call the silent recession that's been going on in schools for some time now. And we think it makes it clear that schools require substantially more in investment from the state and the federal government. Clearly, the situation is not sustainable, and CSBA is going to continue to advocate aggressively for more resources for schools, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level. So with that, we welcome your partnership in our advocacy efforts and all the work that we'll be doing in the coming weeks and months to support you to get more funding into schools and to mitigate the cuts that the governor has proposed so far. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dennis and the other panelists so we can jump into the heart of the governor's May revision and then get to your questions. Dennis.
There on that list, I'll be presenting. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for Government Relations. Also presenting today will be Erica Hoffman and Cheryl Edib. Both of them are advocates who work on various parts of the state budget, and they'll be covering some of the details as well. So let's jump into this and kind of walk this through. Next slide, please. First of all, what a difference a couple of months makes. We wanted to give you kind of the point of reference of where this all started and just go back just a few short months to the January budget. If you recall, there was an increase in the Proposition 98 guarantee, K-14, of just under $4 billion. The governor's proposing a cost of living increase for LCFF and for statutory programs, including special education. And then there was also this piece that at that point we thought was going to be the battle part of the budget between January and June adoption. And if you recall, there was not a small amount of categorical programs that the governor was proposing for one-time funding, about $1.5 billion in one-time programs. And so as we were looking forward to what would have been a very exciting and robust budget development season, our arguments at that point were, hey, school district and county office costs were going up a lot more than just statutory COLA, averaging about 4%. The best thing to do instead of categorizing any amount of money is maybe send that out on a per ADA basis, fully discretionary. And we thought that was going to be our arguments. Those were really how everything was shaping up right on through February and through most of March. And as schools then started to close, there was a forward look into perhaps how the economy was going to be affected. And so we kind of got a sense then that the battle was going to be different. But I just looking back at the middle of January until now, you can see where we started from, and we're going to cover now in the May revision of where we are now. Next slide, please. So as this has developed, really just over the last 6 to 8 weeks, you've been reading the news, as everybody has. Jobless claims are skyrocketing across the nation, here in California especially, to where we're looking at a jobless rate that went from right hovering under 5% to now we're looking at maybe about 20%. And it may settle slightly less than that over summer, but we're looking at a quadrupling of the jobless rate. State and local revenues through March were tracking at or slightly above budgeted amounts. So it really is the hit to the state and local budgets, and then also the Proposition 98 guarantees start really in this last quarter. So starting in April through the end of this fiscal year and then into next fiscal year is where these reductions are really hitting. So unlike the Great Recession, where the slide was slow and deep, this economic impact is expected to be deep, but it's a lot faster. We're talking over a period of a couple of months, not over 18 or 24 months. The impacts, obviously, since state general fund is getting hit as well, and it's all aspects of the state general fund. There are expected reductions in the corporate income tax, personal income tax, sales tax, so it's coming from all sides. And then because of that, there is a reduction to the Proposition 98 guarantee, which is really, what you're all interested in talking about right now. But the 3-year number for the impact on Proposition 98 is $19 billion. And when we say 3 years, whenever the governor's budget comes out, whether it's January, May revision, they always look back a fiscal year, the current fiscal year adjustments, and then looking ahead a fiscal year. So this $19 billion is a 3-year number, but really it's the impact from April of 2019 through the end of next year. So, but it's still a $19 billion look. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to have Cheryl take over here and talk a little bit more about some of the details of the May revision. Cheryl.
So my name is Cheryl, CSBA, to talk more about rosy projections of May revision and Proposition 98 school funding. As Dennis mentioned earlier, it's a $19 billion three-year drop over 18-19, 19-20, and 2021. We see a 10% reduction, or about $6.5 billion in LCFF funding. So it's pretty steep. And we're also not seeing a COLA. At January, we're looking at a 2.29 COLA, as the previously slide said, but it came out at 2.31. That's a federal number, but we're not going to see that funding. We're also going to see about $4.4 billion of the federal funding that the state is setting aside specifically for schools. That $4 billion is in federal discretionary funding, so we're going to see a lot of flexibility in how we can use this funding. But what's greatly going to go out is about $1.5 billion for special education and about $2.855 billion based on if you qualify for concentration grants. And this is to help mitigate the schools that have been impacted the worst. Those with special education students, low-income students, English learners, and foster youth, and homeless youth. Next slide, please.
Hello, my name is Erica Hoffman. Welcome, everybody. Wanted to continue this conversation about funding that's being provided in the budget to help cover some of the shortfall. The governor does look to the funding that was provided under the Federal CARES Act, the $1.6 billion that will be coming to districts with regards to federal funding. About 90% of that, $1.5 billion of it, will be appropriated to LEAs based upon the Title I formula. $100 million will end up going to county offices of education for community school networks, and about $63.2 million of it is going to go for professional development for teachers, administrators, focused on mitigating opportunity gaps and to try to address some equity issues. $1.5 million is in federal funds is also going to the State Department of Education. This will help to cover some of the state COVID costs. The one thing the governor has proposed, as you know, a number of years ago, we passed legislation, or I should say there was an initiative that passed that established the Public School Stabilization Fund. This was the rainy day fund. The budget will basically take all the funding that is currently in there. It's about $524 million. Last year was the first year we made the appropriation into it, and now we're going to empty it out again this year. One of the other things too that I think is probably the best piece of news, especially for all of us who provide special ed services and have been very concerned about that budget. As you know, in the governor's January budget, he did propose an increase in the base rate under the AB 602 formula. That was to have been $660 per ADA. The governor's May revision does continue that. It's only at $645 because there's no COLA in the program now. So that's the difference, the $660 to the $645. But at least that funding is going to go forward. He has promised, I mean, he's special ed is very near and dear to him, and he does know that this is necessary funding in order to keep special ed programs going. There are a number of programs that were zeroed out. Most of those were the governor's January budget proposals, over and above things like the special education funding and a couple of other programs. But for the most part, he zeroed out those. The one thing though, there is a reduction to the remaining categorical programs that exist, and it's about a 10% reduction, and that would include the strong workforce programs. It would include the career tech CTIG program, and there's a list of those that will be funded. But at least it's overall, if you put them together, it's about a 10% reduction total for all the categorical programs. But Dennis, on to you.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. If you're picking up a trend here, there is one. So while the Proposition 98 guarantee is dropping and looking at the cut to LCFF, the governor is trying to mitigate that through the use of federal funds and things like that. Some of the other adjustments to help mitigate that is one that, you saw from January, a real strong push for the state to suspend the coming up increases to CalPERS and CalSTRS employer contribution rates. And here's what the governor's proposing now. So if you recall, in the current Budget Act, there was two pieces of employer contribution relief. The first piece was a direct relief in your contribution rates in the current year and then also in 2021. That reduced the rates by, it varied by system, but it was more than a percentage point. So that was very good, but those were one-time decreases in those rates. Then there was a remaining amount of $2.3 billion that was going to be paid right directly into the systems to reduce the unfunded liability. So the first piece was to lower your payments, and the second piece was to lower the debt, which then had an ongoing impact to lower rates. So what the governor's proposing now in the May revision is to take that second piece and instead of paying off the debt, to take that $2.3 billion and then again buy down your employer contribution rates in 2021 and then also in 21-22. The impact is about a reduction in 2 full percentage points in your contribution rates to both CalSTRS and then also to CalPERS. So those, you know, we were talking beforehand, you know, our lobbying up to this point has been, hey, state, hey, governor, why don't you just defer the, you know, the increase that we expected on July 1, which, you know, was a percent or two. What they have done then is actually gone further than that and given employer contribution relief to actually reduce those rates now between the budget year and then the budget year following that into 2021. So again, it helps mitigate. So while you may be losing on your LCFF, you'd be gaining a few percentage points back by having a lower contribution rate, both into CalPERS and into CalSTRS as well. Now, other parts here is there is a commitment to try to help schools come out of this recession, and that's what this next bullet means. So there is a commitment to increase the state general fund contribution towards the Proposition 98 guarantee starting in the 2021-2022 fiscal year by 1.5%. What that does then, if assuming we're in a test 1 year, and you've heard us talk a lot about test 1 being 38% of the state general fund, what that would do then is increase the share of the state general fund from about 38% to about 40%. So that's not relief that you would see now, but that would then help you climb out of the recession starting after this next fiscal year. So those again are positives. Also, a lot of folks have been saying, well, what about new revenues? So the May revision does look at some new revenues by temporarily suspending some business tax credits. What that means then for the state general fund is about $5 billion. What it means for the Prop 98 guarantee is about $1.8 billion. So again, there's attempts here to try to make up that $19 billion difference. And this one attempt is to actually increase some revenues. Now, we have also lived through the last, the Great Recession, as they called it, through a series of apportionment deferrals. We were suspicious that the state would be looking at deferrals again. And I guess to not disappoint, that's what they're looking at. So there is a proposal to defer probably a little bit more than half of the June apportionment from this year. So this is the apportionment that you would all be receiving by third or fourth week, the third week or so of June of this year. So it's a current year deferral a few weeks into the next fiscal year. What that does is it allows the state to save money on paper in the current year and reduce their obligations. So it allows them to do an accounting maneuver that shows a smaller reduction or a smaller obligation, a smaller debt. What that means for LEAs then is that you have to finance that through your own, use of your own reserves, moving money around, perhaps borrowing from your county treasury. And we're also looking at potentially some statutory changes that perhaps those of you who would need to do a tax revenue anticipation notes, such as the one that's offered by the CSBA, perhaps that might be an option for some of you too. But that's a smaller apportionment for June of this year of $1.9 billion. The state then looks into the next fiscal year and looks then to say looking to save more, and looking at deferrals then that would total about $5.3 billion. So what that proposal then is to take $528 million from the April apportionment and pay that to LEAs in, I'm assuming July, or maybe slightly a little bit late July in the next fiscal year, but also then $2.4 billion then out of May, and then another $2.4 billion out of June. So again, the state is looking to reduce or to help its cash flow by passing some of those cash flow issues down to local educational agencies. So for you as LEAs, that not really becomes essentially a budgeting, but it becomes a cash flow issue. So again, you're going to have to be looking at how you use your own reserves, but also will probably require some of you to do some borrowing again and again, through perhaps CSBA's tax revenue anticipation note program and some other venues as well. But deferrals are back on the table. At the end of the Great Recession, deferrals for Proposition 98 were about just over $9 billion for K-12 schools. And you can see now that just through this May revision and the adoption of this next budget, perhaps we could see deferrals bumping up really fast again, up to totaling about $5.3 billion. Again, that's a cash flow issue, not necessarily a budget reduction issue. In this last bullet here, we just want to talk a bit about triggers, because there is, if things happen elsewhere, perhaps a reduction to some of the amounts that we were talking about here. So who's doing the triggers? I forgot in my notes. Erica, thank you, Erica. Take it away, Erica.
Yeah, no, the governor's proposed a number of programs, including LCFF. He's proposed a trigger that if the state receives increased federal funding from another stimulus bill, be it what the House Democrats have just proposed that they'll be voting on tomorrow, maybe, or what finally comes out after negotiation with the Senate later on this summer, depending upon how much funding comes in from that, especially for education, it will be used to roll back some of these cuts that have been made. There's a list of priorities. The first one, though, being the cuts to LCFF. It'll take, for the 10% cut that LCFF went under, it's going to take about $6.5 billion in federal funds. And so from there, if we hopefully get more than that, we might be able to then further lessen some of the cuts in some of the other proposed programs. So it is something to kind of look forward to as the federal government hopefully stands up for what they need to do in order to support states and schools from the impact of COVID-19. Back to you.
Thank you, Erica. Before moving to the last slide and on to questions, as we've gone through the size of the problem, how the state is trying to make the adjustments, we look at kind of across the board-ish reductions by this 10% cut to LCFF. And we know that, through county offices, charter schools, and school districts that, a cut to LCFF of a certain percentage is a higher dollar amount to those that are high LCFF funded districts, maybe with like a high unduplicated count. Those of you with lower unduplicated counts, then that 10% cut is a smaller dollar amount. But again, it's a 10% cut nonetheless. The state's attempt to mitigate that through the use of federal funds doesn't come right back in equal shares, because some of that is coming like through a Title I allocation, or maybe favors allocations that are through like the supplemental concentration grant formulas through LCFF. But areas that do mean a lot and are equitably distributed are, mitigation through reduction of the PERS and STIRS contribution rates. So those figures really are making your payroll 2 to 3% more affordable to you in the budget year and in the budget year that follows. So the reason why I'm saying that is because some of the cuts are not, some of the cuts and mitigations aren't going out exactly equally on a per ADA basis to all the LEAs. And so your next, as you discuss these locally, you're going to not be exactly talking about the same dollar amounts maybe as the school district or the county office next door. With that also is, there's also basic aid districts, and these are districts that are funded entirely through property taxes. Everything that we have been talking about so far really talks about those districts that are getting state funding. So basic aid districts are impacted as much as they get categorical funding. So Erica talked about that kind of that 10% cut to existing categorical programs. They will benefit, obviously, from the governor trying to protect the increase in special ed funding. And then one other thing is, we don't know yet what the expected decrease in property tax revenue might be here. We know the state is calculating that. The state is reducing the amount that they think property taxes may grow. So that obviously is an impact that you, as those basic aid districts that are listening, will have to factor in. And then, of course, going from 5% growth in property taxes maybe down to 2% requires you to reduce, but you're still growing. But we also know that there will be some parts of the state in basic aid areas that might actually see a reduction in property tax revenues. So let's go to the next slide. We just want to kind of talk about what happens over the next few months, and then we can open it up for questions. This really does start the focus of budget season. The legislature is now back. I'm going to say in session. I'm going to hold, the quote marks up there. What that means is they have at least half of each house in Sacramento now, so that they can be in session and hold hearings. They are focusing entirely on the budget, wildfires, because, in some of the emergency things that the state budget has to also be directed at, and then just a handful of priority legislation. So the hundreds and hundreds of bills that were introduced in January and February are now being trimmed down to just a handful, and that also impacts education as well. But there's still this June 15th constitutional deadline to adopt a budget. There will be a budget adopted by June 15th. I'm just absolutely confident that's going to happen. Is it complete? That's what we're not completely sure of, but it's going to be a balanced budget. And the reason why I say is it complete is because if you've also been reading the headlines, as you know, that the governor extended the filing deadline for income taxes from April 15th to July 15th. So there's a major portion of the state general fund that is being estimated now, but they don't really know the final numbers. So there is a chance that the budget might have to be adjusted in August. But I'm saying that not to create more, worry for you. Obviously, our work between now and budget adoption is to take care of some of these issues of allocation and distribution, trying to get you more flexibility locally, but also to make sure that the budget they adopt for June or by June 15th is the budget that you can expect as an LEA, because there is just no way you would be able to reopen safely and then 2 or 3 weeks later see a different budget adopted. So we think the state is on track with that as well, but obviously it means that we've got some work to do. So Troy, I think you've been looking at questions. What kind of questions do you have for us?
Every kind of question you can imagine, Dennis, but we'll start out with one which kind of frames the challenges that our districts are facing. This person wants to know, what will the cuts proposed in the governor's May revise translate to at the ground level for students in schools? Does this mean fewer teachers, larger class sizes? What should we look for?
One thing that the governor did say today, and also it was backed up by when his budget director, Keely Bosley, took the microphone, is how every school district and county office and charter school in the state is going to have to figure this out. And so all of what I think was in that question, Troy, factors down to the local level is how do you adjust staff? Do you have layoffs? Do you have golden handshake programs? How can you trim? What does it look like for your leadership team, your central office team? Things like that all have to be figured out as you look through your budget adoption process, which now starts now. You have to adjust it through actual budget and then get to your final budget adoption, which is the end of June. So it's going to be customized in every LEA across the state.
So
Thanks,
can
Dennis.
so with that, Dennis or Cheryl or Erica, do you want to mention some of the flexibility that was also discussed today or included in the budget that might go to this person's question about how to deal with it locally?
So one of the things that CSBA has been advocating for that might be helpful because it looks at your entire general fund budget is that especially when the state provides pension relief on behalf of school employers, that can be calculated into your routine restricted maintenance account at 3%. And that's the problem that's actually been happening. And so you're taking a large proportion of funding that you never received. So what we talked to the administration about was actually removing that portion so that that 3% doesn't eat into a larger portion of your general fund. Erica, do you have any other ones that you think are largely notable?
No, that's probably the bigger ones right now. A lot of it is in just the fact that they've offset various other costs, so at least the funding is there. I think that's the big piece. I mean, I've at least got to say that the administration is trying to backfill where they can rather than make a larger cut. So I think that works. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is through all of this, you still need to plan for your social distancing and how you're going to actually get students onto campuses, off campuses, and what types of programs you're going to need for distance learning for those students who are not going to be able to be on the campus. So.
Yeah, I think there are other issues that are on the table. So we have had lots of conversations here in Sacramento with the administration, with the Department of Education about other flexibilities that we believe are, I'll just say, on the table for consideration. One is for those of you in the state school construction program, there's the regular routine maintenance requirement of 3%. So there are the reserve requirements that are general, but then there are routine maintenance requirements as well. So if you recall, during the Great Recession, those were rolled back a bit, and then coming out of the recession, they're added back. So there's discussion on, okay, maybe we can free up a few percentage points that way. But then again, that benefits several hundred districts who actually have state school construction money, but not everybody. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that are on the table as well. There's a conversation about your budget adoption process. Right now, you have to adopt your budget for the budget year +1 and +2. So that 3-year projection causes some problems in the current year. And so there's some conversations about maybe eliminating that 3rd year requirement. Again, there's pluses and minuses of doing that. There's also a look at independent study requirements, because a lot of you are going to be relying very heavily on either a hybrid model or distance learning. So things like that to make your life a little easier as you reopen. And then lastly, it's not really an issue of flexibility, although it comes up in the conversation, is a hold harmless in your enrollments. So there's conversation here about moving away from an average daily attendance system to an enrollment system, and whether or not that's appropriate to do in the coming fiscal year. At least what we're saying to the state is, if that's a broader conversation, because there are policy implications there, perhaps then just hold us harmless through our February P1 apportionment of current year. Just say, all right, enrollment as of February 1, which is pre-COVID-19, that same enrollment, we're just going to hold you all through next fiscal year. So those are kind of the things there. That's like a half a dozen items that are being bantered about, but I think they're all pretty serious. And I think that enrollment versus hold harmless on ADA, those kind of things are actually at the top of a lot of folks' lists. So.
And I would just add, I would just add two other things that were that are being discussed as of today. Are also, when we all remember this from the Great Recession, right, is the authority to use the proceeds from the sale of surplus property for one-time general fund purposes. You know, if you have to be in that situation to sell your surplus property, obviously that can help you on a one-time basis. And then I think for more of kind of the budget wonks in the audience, the increases in internal interfund borrowing limits have been increased as well as a part of the proposed revise. Cheryl, or were you going to add to that?
Yeah, that was actually what I was going to say. You got it.
Okay.
So as you can hear, there's a lot of information, a lot of discussions that are going on to try and give districts as much flexibility as possible to deal with this unprecedented fiscal crisis. Many of you had asked about enrollment, so I didn't want it to get lost in the midst of those answers. That Dennis did confirm that there are discussions about at least temporarily modifying the ADA model towards something more enrollment-based, at least in part. And so nothing is conclusive yet, but those discussions are ongoing for those of you who asked about that. Also want to take the chance to address a couple questions that are seeking to clarify how the 10% reduction works. A number of people asked whether this is all a cut to the base funding, or does it also include cuts to supplemental and concentration funding? And then some people asked whether if you take the reduction in COLA or the elimination of the 2.31 COLA and add that to the 10% cut, is it actually more of a 12% cut? Is that a fair way to characterize it? So Cheryl, would you speak to those issues?
Yeah, those are really, really good technical, very, very technical questions. So we did ask this question, and specifically the way that the breakdown was is that if you looked at 1920 funding as a budget act, it's a 10% reduction of that. If you looked at governor's budget and you built your budget off of that, it's a 7.7% reduction. And what the way that they calculated that is they applied the 2.31% COLA and then did the cut from there. So that's what that 10% is. That's what that looks like. That's the breakdown of that.
And the question also then is it's to entire LCFF funding. So it's not a reduction just to the base grant. It's going to be a reduction to each LEA's LCFF entitlement. Right, Cheryl, is that how that works out?
Yeah, and then the way that the supplemental and concentration grants are, they're built off of percentage of LCFF, so those will be reduced accordingly as well.
Right. You're muted, Troy.
And then to touch on another issue which was addressed earlier, but I think it's worth isolating so people understand. A number of viewers asked questions about deferrals. How will they be able to pay staff? I know you referenced the trans program that's available. So can you speak to that again?
Sure. It's and you can discuss this, with your staff locally, but a deferral is not a cut. A deferral is delaying payment to you. So what a deferral is it allows the state to save its cash flow but transfer that cash flow problem to you as an LEA. So here's an example. Let's say your fiscal year budget is $100 million. And you're expected you're budgeting, let's say 95 million of that, and 5% you're putting away in reserves, or you're putting aside for, let's say, future purchases of, 5 school buses or something. If you're expecting that then in payments coming to you, part of that is through your property taxes, which you receive twice a year, and then the remainder is chopped up in 12 apportionments. So let's then say now that you're expecting 100 million, but through the end of next year, let's say, I'm making up the number here. Let's say 6 million of that is deferred, okay? So your budgeted amount is still going to be the same. You're still going to be looking at 100 million, But 6 million of that you're going to get in July of next year, not in April, May, June of this budget year. So what that means then is, okay, I have bills to pay. I don't need to reduce, but I need to somehow manage my cash flow so I can pay those bills now and then get paid for that in July of the following fiscal year. So it's moving around your internal cash flow. So it's looking at reserves. That's what reserves are for, is things like that. You're going to be looking at your general reserve. You're going to be looking at assigned and unassigned reserves, things that you may have set aside. Like I said, maybe you set aside money for a big purchase. You might be able to move some of that over, spend that money now, and then get paid back and pay those funds off separately later. You can do what we call a tax revenue and anticipation note, which then you're borrowing from somebody like CSBA's trans pool to then cover that dry period. Then you pay that note off in January or in July when you get paid by the state. So again, it's not necessarily a reduction in funding. It's just a way that you're going to have to manage your cash flow for that dry period at which you're not going to be getting money from the state. So I'm going to ask Troy, do you think I answered the question enough, or is there a little bit more that has to be? Because it's slight nuance, but again, it's not a reduction. If someone came to CSBA and said, do you want $1 billion cut or do you want $1 billion referral? We have to really think that perhaps deferrals are much more preferential because your spending authority stays the same. It's not money taken away from you. It's just money that you have to finance.
I think that's a good answer, Dennis, but also that governing teams need to talk about that amongst themselves with their chief business officer or CFO to determine the best way to manage their cash flow.
Right.
We also received a number of questions about layoff windows, particularly August layoff windows. Do people anticipate any adjustments or changes to that process?
We can anticipate attempts to change it. So for those of you who are wondering what that means, is there is a layoff window that it's a second layoff window that starts July 1st through August 15th for certificated staff. As you know, classified staff, there's no window. There's a 60-day layoff notice. But for certificated staff, there's a March 15th deadline. But then there's the second look if you don't get an increase in your LCFF funding of at least 2%. So it's quite obvious that in this budget, there's not going to be a 2% increase to LCFF funding. So that second window then does open up from July 1st to August 15th. So it's there. It's in statute. To be 100% honest with you, the state has messed with it in the past. So in 2011 and 2012, when the revenue limit back then did not grow by 2%, the state took that authority away. So we will be saying, as much as we don't want to lay folks off, that window absolutely has to stay open. And so part of our work and part of your work as local school board members and the governance team will have to really talk to legislators to make sure that that language doesn't get kind of sneaked into, kind of the midnight version of what we call the budget trailer bill. That window has to stay open to allow you to mitigate some of these reductions. So it's there. We just have to make sure that it stays there.
And just so we're clear for the audience, the politics relative to this is pretty straightforward, which is that the unions would not want that. Would not want districts to be able to utilize that window of time. So they will actually be advocating to limit your ability to utilize that so that their members can remain employed.
Sure.
The next question I'll direct to Erica because it's on a federal level. The question asker wants to know whether the $4.4 billion federal money, which is described as classroom-based, means that it would not be available to pay for expenses related to distance learning. Do you have any insight on that?
Yes, I do. Yes, it says it's classroom based, and what they're trying to get to is that it's keeping it away from more of the virtual charter schools and the virtual, outside program, but use for school districts who, are basically classroom based programs, even for their distance learning, that it would be a usable cost on that. At least that's how it was described this afternoon. Still looking for the language, but it wasn't to prohibit districts from using it for distance learning in response to COVID and that sort of thing. It was more to try to ensure that this went to school districts, even charter schools, but those that have programs that have been disrupted by the COVID.
So one thing that Erica mentioned here is language. So what we're dealing with right now is the governor's statements, his director of finance statements, which were all verbal. We also have a 100-page summary, so that's in print. We also just about an hour and a half before we start, or about 2 hours before we started this this webcast, we had a quick briefing from Department of Finance staff. There'll be another one on Monday. But really, where it really comes down to is what's the trailer bill language look like? So we will see that in the coming weeks, which is where the detail that Erica just tried to describe from notes and bullets and conversations, we got to see that language. And it affects everything we've talked about today. Not just that 4.4 billion, but every little piece. We're going to go through every item of that trailer bill language to make sure it makes sense, that it's doable, doesn't lock our hands, make sure that like the layoff language isn't in lewd or something like that. But we'll see that. I don't know, Erica or Cheryl, if the Department of Finance told us when we can expect that trailer bill language, but I know it's not in print right now.
No, and they didn't specify. I would say at least a week and a half.
Okay.
Just because that's how long it'll take to get it finalized through Legislative Council and out to print. Budget hearings for education, we have one next Monday in the Assembly on the 25th. In the Senate, yes, we are working Memorial Day. So hopefully maybe by the 25th, we might have it in print. But with a couple of more briefings from finance, we'll also get a clearer picture of where they're headed. But they were very specific, at least saying, no, this was not to harm school districts on the 4.4, that they would have this money to be using for all of their programs. So,
great.
or across their programs.
Great, thank you.
One member of our audience comments on the fact that unemployment is at record levels and that wages, of course, are going to be down and many more families will be qualifying for free and reduced lunch. When would we expect to see an increase reflected on Title I allocations?
Wow, who wants that one? So we know that Congress is looking at another round of stimulus, and whether or not the Democrats in the House and the Republicans in the Senate can bring that together. But nutrition was a part of what the Democrats proposed the last couple of days. So, obviously that's part of our federal advocacy as well. It's not just Department of Education allocations, it's also Department of Ag and other places that we're going to be advocating for some extra assistance as well, because the question is right, is our food costs are going to be going up because of more people qualifying, and the fact that we're just now, most of you aren't asking a lot of questions as you're getting the food distributed. You're distributing it come one, come all, and we expect some of that to continue. What that means is then, school board members, as you're talking to members of Congress, make sure that they know about your needs and your increased costs in that specific area, as well as distance learning and your Title I and other allocations as well, because it's all important. It all feeds into that question.
Dennis, if I could add on to that briefly, one thing I would urge when you do talk to your members of Congress, let them know how many meals you're serving, how much of that is more feeding the community, not just your students. I know a lot of districts, a lot of county offices, you are all feeding your communities now. And the one question I've been asked by, because I've had a lot of discussions with staff lately back in Washington, what federal funding programs would help. And I'm thinking it's things like if schools could start getting access to the SNAP program at a greater level, things of that nature. So that might be something you want to just put in your congressional member's ear, that you're feeding communities now as the nonprofits in your areas are running out of funding and aren't necessarily there to help all these families, and the food banks are overstretched. So you're feeding them, and if you could get access to that same type of funding or some of the federal level funding for full meals, that would be helpful.
Good point.
I think that's a great point about the central role that schools are playing in dealing with this crisis. And relative to that, we had a number of questions which asked whether there is any money in this budget specifically for the services that schools are providing, whether that's the nutrition services or whether it's the equipment and services they'll need to reopen schools safely, personal protective equipment, testing measures, what have you. Is there anything specific to getting schools open again and open safely that is earmarked in this budget?
So
No.
we know that there are parts of the May revision that are not directed at schools, like on the whole healthcare side. That work that we're doing within CSBA to feed the administration is, here's what it's going to take for schools to open safely in the fall. So PPE for classified, certificated protection for students, all those things are things that we are calculating need on now. Distance learning needs, for hardware, software for broadband access, what is needed to clean classrooms more robustly and on a more frequent basis. All those kinds of things we need to calculate more because I think the governor's done an admirable job at trying to mitigate the drop in Proposition 98, but there's not a real realistic look at what is school going to cost you in your August or September reopening, assuming that that's going to happen. So that's more work that we have to do. And those are conversations that we would say, if you've got a conversation scheduled tomorrow with your state senator, you have enough now to talk about. But we will be getting more talking points and more analysis out in early next week to make sure that you are armed with those details. But right now, yeah, we have to really help identify some of those specific issues.
And let me just say too that, and again, and just talking about the education piece of the budget, right? We have not, as Dennis said, we have not looked at the other parts of the budget, and whether it's the health budget, the state budget. We have not looked at that thus far. But this is part of the reason why, for all of you who don't know, why CSBA early on was advocating to the administration that they include enough money to cover these costs, and frankly, to even consider some type of bond, whether it's a revenue bond, some type of bond that the state could put forward to provide that money for districts to cover the costs that you've incurred in the current year in response to COVID-19, and in the fall, or when the school year opens up again, recognizing that we knew that the state was going to be looking at less revenue for 2020-21. This could have been an avenue to pursue to help you at least cover some of these costs, if not all of these costs, in response to COVID-19, whether it's hand sanitizer, whatever social distancing you'll have to do when you ultimately open up school, et cetera, and also as well as hardware, hotspots and things of that nature. So we're going to continue to look at other revenue sources and urge the administration and the legislature to continue to look into those, because those are obviously are real hard costs that, at least for the foreseeable future in the next few months, are not going to go away for all of you.
Thank you, Vernon. One person wants to know, how will necessary small schools be affected? Do we have information on that?
I always look at these Q&As as stump the staff. I think we just got stumped, so we're gonna have to delve into that, because there's the LCFF funding, And then there's a necessary small school funding based on the size. It's not addressed. I don't believe it was addressed in the list that we've seen of the categorical programs
No,
that received a 10% cut. Technically, that's not LCFF funding, so I'm not sure that the 10% cut is impacted there. So we're going to have to do a little more research on that, and you'll see that in the information we put out in upcoming days. So thank you. Thanks for making me embarrassed. That was a good question.
It has to happen at least once in the course of the webinar, right? We also had some questions about basic aid districts, quite a few. I know you addressed it in your remarks, but a lot of people are interested, so just want to make sure it's clear. We have questions about how this budget impacts basic aid districts. Will they be subjected to a fair share cut? What can they anticipate?
Okay, yeah, no, and it's good because, you know, if you recall what happened in the Great Recession is there was a fair share cut. The fair share cut happened before LCFF. You remember LCFF took 50 categorical programs.
Oh, actually, Dennis, sorry, can I interrupt? I'm realizing some of our viewers may not know what a basic aid district is. So Can you explain that?
Okay, sure. So basic aid school districts are districts that are funded 100% by property taxes. So every district is, a calculation is made every year by the Department of Education on their entitlement for the local control funding formula. And then property taxes collected by each school district and county office are then deducted from that amount. And then the difference is funded by the state. Basic aid districts are those districts that have more property taxes coming in than what they are entitled to under LCFF funded. So that's what those districts are. So they're basically all locally funded except for categorical programs that, like special education, that they still get. So pre-LCFF, there were basic aid districts, but there were also 50-some categorical programs. So what occurred then is that as school districts were cut in their revenue limits, basic aid districts received a cut to their categorical programs that was in addition to some of what we call the haircut that was given to categorical programs across the board. So they contributed a few $100 million of categorical money that they never really got back. Now you fast forward to current, almost all the money goes out. So probably 90% of the K-12 portion of the Proposition 98 formula goes out through the local control funding formula. That extra 10% left is categorical programs, and probably half of it is special education. So now we're talking about special education and a few smaller programs. So the way it's working now is the cuts look like they are being targeted towards LCFF. Those remaining categorical programs, special ed looks protected as of now. And so no real haircut targeting basic aid districts. It looks like that 10% reduction is however each LEA plays into, you know, some of the career money and the workforce money, things like that. So nothing targeting basic aid districts. Their reduction is going to come basically through, again, like I said, whatever categorical programs they're playing in, but that's through all, you know, shared with all school districts and county offices. But then whatever reductions might happen to their local property tax revenue, which is going to be determined locally based on the market.
A number of viewers also wondered about the impact on CTE. How will CTIG and K-12 strong workforce be affected? Some of our ROP members had questions about CTE and related programs.
I'll let Cheryl or Erica cover that.
Yeah, I can take that question. So the categoricals received about a $352.9 million reduction, specifically for CTE and career technical education, for CTE and strong workforce. They saw a 50% reduction of their overall apportionment combined. So what we saw for the new proposal in May is that the strong workforce is going to have 79.4 million and CTIG will have 77.4 million as proposed.
Okay.
Great. One member of our audience wants to know how the state is going to handle the large number of qualified and negative budgets that are likely to result. Are all of these districts going to be going into receivership, or how will the state handle this?
That's a very good question. And if you look at the statutes, we call them the AB 1200 statutes, but really they're exactly what you talked about. So, when you adopt your budget, you're looking at what's your next year look like, and then out 2 years. And then a couple of times each fiscal year, you have to certify each, how you're doing on cash flow at that moment and into the future. So the certifications are where the terms are positive, qualified, and negative come from. So if you're qualified, it means that you might not be able to meet your obligations. If you're negative, you're certifying that you cannot meet your obligations. That results in certain actions between your school district and your county office of education, or your county office of education and the state superintendent of public instruction, based on real hands-on looking and working through budget adjustments and cuts and things that you need to do to then be able to certify positive. State intervention really comes in if there is need for a bailout loan. I have, been lobbying for a long time, and it's amazing the amount of decisions that you all make locally to make sure that that doesn't happen. But the real state takeover, with appointment of trustees and administrators and things, really happens when you come to the state to get a loan, or if you don't make those adjustments to get from negative certification into qualified or positive. So right now, it's workload and manpower for the state, and then for your county office to make sure they're working through coming to a positive certification. But as I said, state takeover, I think it really is last resort on your part as a governing board. It's not automatic. You really have to not be able to balance your budget and run to Sacramento and say, I need help. Then they pass a bill that says, here's money to loan, which you got to pay back. And by the way, school board, you have zero authority. I mean, those are what happens when you pass a bill. But a lot has to happen between now and when that would actually occur. I'm not saying don't worry. I'm just saying there's a lot that you have to do to make sure the budget balances and stays balanced throughout the year.
And let me just one other comment on that, just to build off what Dennis is saying. And if you look at the AB 1200 statutes, I really do think they are built or designed to really try and, for lack of a better word, force you to try and make those tough decisions locally, and working locally and with your county office. And obviously sometimes that doesn't happen. But like Dennis, I've been around for a long time, and let me just be very upfront and frank. I don't think you ever want to be in that situation of, if you can avoid it, of having to get a loan from the state and then losing all of your governing authority. And on top of that, if we look at the history or the track record of where the state has come in and managed those districts that have actually asked for or needed a loan, and there's a number of instances where it has just not been very positive for those districts, extended periods of time under state receivership, if you will, more money going out. So I think here again, the point is based on, as Dennis explained it, is you really want to make the tough decisions early on and upfront to really avoid any type of state intervention.
Yeah, good point.
And so something the governor referred to today in his press conference was a possibility that some school districts might have longer school years to make up for learning loss that's happened during this period of distance learning. But a number of people are asking questions about whether they might get some sort of relief or waiver to have fewer than the mandated school days or fewer than the mandated instructional minutes. Quite a few questions about the possibility of furloughs as well. So can you speak to that, and if that's something that various people in the education community might be pushing for?
Yeah, I mean, that was part of, I think, what I was trying to remember are issues that are being talked about here in Sacramento. So yeah, if you recall, during the Great Recession, there was a reduction in the number of days in the school year. So there have been some conversations and proposals made to try to do that again, which means then that you could do furlough days, things like that. So yeah, those are part of what you would kind of put in the bucket of flexibility, and to see what kind of shakes out. Then it's going to be depend on I'm going to say the political will of the legislature to do some of those things. It's easier if the state does it. That way you don't have to negotiate all that stuff locally. So we'll see, how strong in their leadership could be. Not just on that issue, but on some of the other issues that we've talked about before. But not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, but up for consideration.
Okay. One viewer wants to know about what you might call the middle class districts. We've spoken about those districts who have high concentrations of LCFF, as well as the basic aid districts that are more on average affluent, not all of them being affluent, but more likely affluent. This particular viewer wants to know, what about the districts that are in the middle, maybe those districts that don't quite qualify for concentration grants, but still have poverty and are running leanly? What is their future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because a 10% cut, whether you're I'll say a high funded LCFF district or a low funded LCFF district, is still a 10% cut. So the budgeting decisions are similar, but the populations are different, and some of the mitigations that you need to make sure that learning happens are going to be different. So that's, I think, one thing that we talked about a little bit earlier is the cuts are basically coming through LCFF, but some of the mitigations, let's say the allocation of some of the federal money comes out through Title I, things like that, are trying to do that on a more equitable basis, based on equity, not equitable like a per ADA, but more of an equity-based basis. And then some of the other relief, like the pension obligations, are across the board. So it really just kind of comes down to what your population is going to look like, what does it need, whether or not you can add days to the year. The governor is suggesting, you're not going to see a bill that says you got to do it, but he's saying, hey, it'd be nice if we can mitigate some of this learning loss. So we're going to give you some flexible money, and hopefully you can deal, with some learning loss issues. And some of you might be able to add days. We know that's unlikely, but again, he will talk about that, because it would be a nice thing if we had enough money that you could do a 190-day school year, but we know that that's really unlikely. It's kind of a meandering, rambling answer to a question, because it really is going to be determined on kind of what the priorities and how this shakes out for you in each of those districts. Some of you are have very low and duplicated counts. And your reductions are just as real as those with high and duplicated counts as well.
Okay. One person wants to know about lottery revenues. And before we get into this, I just want to say this is my mandatory disclaimer that lottery revenues make up less than 2% of total state funding for public schools. So don't think that this is a huge boon for public schools. But in respect to the question, they want to know if we should expect a drop in lottery revenues, and is that going to have a significant impact?
I'm going to assume yes. I did not look at, and we probably won't see what the state's estimate is on lottery revenue, and so I didn't look at any other of the the 70 pages of the summary to see what their expectations are. But I think we can expect in an economy where there are fewer people working, that perhaps lottery revenue may drop. And so, but what I want to do is I want to kind of try to answer that question eventually by looking at at what happened to lottery revenues during the Great Recession. I think we can probably model that, but I would expect that there would be some sort of a slight drop. But you're right, Troy. I mean, I think it's 1%. I'm even convinced that it's 2%. It's a very, very small percent of your budgets.
1%.
And I think most of it is probably committed in one way or the other. So it's definitely not going to be something that's going to bail anybody out by any stretch of the imagination.
You know, it actually, they had a report that came out today though and said that scratcher tickets are up. The sale of scratcher tickets are up tremendously. So
People are being hopeful. They're trying to bail themselves out by winning the lottery.
Yeah, scratcher tickets are going to save our public schools. I don't think that's the case, but we haven't talked much about county offices of education, and a couple of viewers wanted to know what are the specific implications for COEs, if any.
Well, there are some. So yeah, obviously the reduction to LCFF is county offices. County offices have a similar but different calculation for local control funding formula based on the number of districts in their county, but also on the types of students. So that 10% cut impacts them as well. Obviously, special education is a plus that benefits county offices as well as school districts and charter schools. And then to the extent that county offices are into career tech, or maybe they may run or manage the regional occupational center program, things like that. So depending on how they play into the categoricals that also receive a 10% cut, that will be determined kind of county office by county office as well. And I don't know, Cheryl and Erica, if I'm kind of hitting all the issues. Obviously the federal, how the $4.4 billion gets distributed, obviously, kind of helps mitigate that as well. But I think I kind of covered everything. Did I get everything through the conversations you've had? Did I cover everything?
Yeah, through the conversations that we had today and from what I've read so far, which is just an overview, I think you hit most of it, because they'll get processed in very much the same way everybody else has done. I mean, if you get Title I and all those, which they do, so they'd be getting some of those too.
There was a piece of the I can't remember if it was in the first round of CARES Act. There was $100 million that was proposed for county offices to help the county offices build networks for community schools. So that is something that's specific and new. Outside of that, the rest is they'll play as the rest of the LEAs do, but there is something set aside and proposed, I think, on the side for community school expansion. So
yeah, and that's to do to develop networks of community schools, coordinating health, mental health, social support services for high need students. And there is that piece. I don't know yet how that will be distributed. It doesn't necessarily talk to that, but they do say it's grants, so there might be an application process. But as soon as we find out the specifics, which will be in trailer bill language for some part of it, we can get that out.
And and just it's an easy thing to get nervous when you hear the word grant, and that obviously makes us nervous as well. So once we delve more into that program and look at actual language, our interest would be to make sure that plays across the state pretty fairly and pretty evenly, because we know that the needs in various county offices, it's not like you can say, oh, let's give that $100 million out to 3 county offices. I mean, the need is going to be statewide. So more on that later as we see the language, and then we'll be trying to shape that as well. Great question.
A number of questions related to childcare and early childhood education. Is there any funding specifically for that? We know that's important for parents and guardians who are trying to get back to work, whether that's on a school site or elsewhere in the general economy. What in the budget speaks to that issue?
There's reductions in preschool childcare and before and after school care throughout the budgets that are all triggered by federal funding. So to the extent that we received funding from the HEROES Act, then hopefully those can be mitigated, but there are cuts throughout, reductions of slots throughout, unfortunately.
So that's unfortunate to hear, but every sector is taking cuts, and that's just part of the current reality. Is how do we adapt to that? We also had a question whether the FICMAT might have the LCFF calculator ready soon so boards and governing teams can use that in reevaluating their budgets.
You can count on it. The people at FICMAT are fast and efficient, so I bet if we were to call them right now, they wouldn't answer their phones, not because it's 6 o'clock at night, probably because they're making sure that that stuff happens. So yeah, it's going to happen very quickly because that's what they're really good at. We're going to be looking for that too. So I think your budget folks are going to be seeing that emailed out to them very, very quickly.
Thanks for that. Also, mental health. This relates to some of the other issues we talked about, the extraordinary expenses related to COVID-19 that schools are incurring. Are there cuts to mental health services that are going to have a direct impact on what schools are able to provide?
I haven't fully looked at the mental health budget overview yet. That is something I still need to finish looking at tonight. There have been a couple of things that have occurred outside of the budget, one of them being for those in the LEA and the LEA billing program. We've actually gotten authorization from the Center for Medicaid Care and Studies at the federal level to be able to use telehealth for some of those services, which would include some of the mental health. There is a reference within some of the flexibility language that the governor put out in education that you could use funds potentially to do some special needs for special ed students through telehealth, and which then would also include mental health. But I will be looking at the mental health budget to see what type of access there is there. Hopefully there's some expansion on the use so that schools can better tap into some of those funds. And we'll put that out as soon as I get through those pages.
Thank you, Erica. One person said that the budget seems to be premised on the idea that we're beyond the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what happens if there's some sort of resurgence and we have to go back to school closures and the distance learning environment? Is there some sort of subsequent reckoning in the budget, or what provisions are made to deal with that?
He doesn't really have anything specific in the budget. And keep in mind, he also doesn't tell schools how they need to establish their programs coming up this fall. Be it some sort of hybrid program, all kids on campus, very few kids on campus, half and half, however you set that up. I mean, the governor's been very clear, those are local decisions. But I think there's always a piece of it that's in the back of everybody's mind that if it's not done right and if we don't have all the health and safety precautions in place, yeah, we could have another problem. Or we would be back to distance learning, but he doesn't predispose the budget on that, but I think that is in the back of a lot of everybody's minds.
Cheryl.
I just wanted to just claw back for 1 second on the childcare piece, because while several of the issues that are happening on the state side all have trigger language that's related to federal funding, there is CARES Act federal funding for childcare that includes about $350 million for various stipends and fee waivers. So I just wanted to include that. That's not a huge amount, but it is something. So.
And if I can, Troy, I want to just piggyback off of Erica's comments to this question, because I think that is the $1 million question, right? I think everyone, as Erica said, what's that?
$1 billion question.
$1 billion, yeah, let's make it $1 billion. That is the $1 billion question, according to Erica, that is in the back of everyone's minds. And I think for any of us that are involved in schools, and particularly if you have kids in school or if you teach in schools, I think I can ask any of you, what is the first thing that happens within the first 2 to 3 months when kids come back to school in a normal year? The answer would be is they get sick, right? I mean, all of us know that, and that's without coronavirus. So I think because of that, I think everyone, particularly those in the public health sector, recognize that particularly in the fall, there is a higher risk of us having a second wave. And unfortunately, while I think everyone understands that, the budget, the May revised, does not, at least from the education side, doesn't seem to reflect that strong possibility or that possibility. And that will then again put additional pressure on you to respond locally. Again, I go back to that's why CSBA have been urging the administration and the legislature, and will continue to look at some type of one-time funding, whether it be through some type of revenue bond or something, to provide you with up to $2 billion worth statewide, at least $2 billion to pay for some of the costs that may come associated with having to, one, start school back up, but then two, if you encounter a second wave. Because right now, as you can see in the revise, the money is just simply not there. But it is something that potentially could happen, and you're going to have to confront in the coming months.
Great, Vernon. I think that's a good way to wrap it up. But before we go, I want the CSBA members to know that we will have an email blast coming out this evening, which will go through a detailed review of the May revised budget and cover many of the issues that we discussed here. Also, tomorrow we will post a recording of this particular webinar, which you can view at your leisure, as well as the PowerPoint deck will also be posted to our website. Again, that's csba.org/coronavirus. While you're there on that website, you can find a number of resources related to COVID, especially those advocacy tools like sample emails, sample call scripts, sample media posts that you and your communities can use to tell your legislators, both state and federal, that we need more funding in order to serve all students well and to deal with the cost of COVID-19 so we can reopen schools in a manner that's safe and effective for students, staff, and community. And finally, for those who ask for more information about programs to receive loans to help you with deferrals, there is a spotlight on the main CSBA website for our trans program. You can access that to get more information about the deferrals to help you bridge the gap until you have more revenue. Again, thanks for your time. We're approaching the 90-minute mark, so we will sign off now. Don't hesitate to contact CSBA directly or go to our website for more information. You'll see there on the final slide the email addresses of today's presenters. They will work to get back to you. It's a busy time, so response may be slightly delayed, but we recognize the urgency that you're all working under to get new budget projections so that you can give the realistic picture to your school communities. Thank you. Have a good night. We hope to see you again soon.